I want to return to the equations we've been working with in the Keynesian model and integrate into those equations the fiscal policy, taxes, and spending that we've been talking about in this section. So just to return to the example we were working with in the previous section of the course, suppose we've got an economy that is stuck in an unemployment equilibrium of output and income of, say, $1,600. That is to say, in equilibrium, the economy is producing $1,600 worth of output, but we know that if the economy were fully employed, it would be producing $2,000 of output and income. Suppose also that autonomous consumption is $100, intended investment is $300, and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75 or 3/4. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, then what's the multiplier? By now, you should be able to make that calculation. The multiplier is given by 1 over 1 minus the MPC, which is the same thing as 1 over the MPS. So 1 over 1/4, which is a multiplier of 4. What this tells us is that every dollar of additional spending in the economy is going to increase output and income by $4. So we have a recessionary gap, the gap in output and income between equilibrium and full employment, of $400. Again, I said full employment output and income is $2,000. Equilibrium output and income is $1,600. So the gap is $400. What this tells us then is that we need $100 of additional spending, which will then multiply through by 4 to close the gap in output and income. So what we're going to look at in this video are two fiscal policy options for closing that gap. One is increasing government spending, and the two is simply decreasing taxes. And I'll make a note that increasing transfer payments would essentially have the same effect as a decrease in taxes for our purposes here. Let's look at each of these in more detail, starting with increased government spending. Since we know that we need $100 more spending, the simplest solution is simply to have the government increase its spending by $100. Again, this would multiply through by 4 to increase equilibrium output and income to $2,000, which is our full employment target. We could integrate government spending into our equation for equilibrium output and income that we've been working with in the past by simply adding it as another type of autonomous spending. So equilibrium output and income is now 1 over the MPS, that's the multiplier, times the sum of autonomous consumption, C bar, intended investment, I sub I, and now G for government spending. With the numbers we have, that's 1 over 0.25, the multiplier 4, times 100 for autonomous consumption, 300 for intended investments, and 100 for government spending now, which means equilibrium output and income is now 4 times 500, or again, 2,000. The alternative approach, the alternative fiscal policy that we could do to close this recessionary gap is we could decrease taxes. But again, a tax decrease operates more indirectly as compared to government spending. Specifically, a $100 tax cut is not going to be sufficient to close that recessionary gap, whereas a $100 government spending increase would. The reason is because part of that tax cut will leak back out as savings and never become spending anyways. So we're going to integrate tax cuts into our equation simply by changing that y term in our consumption function. Before it's just been y, now we're going to make it y sub d. And the d simply stands for disposable. So we're talking now about y sub d as disposable income, which is just y minus taxes, y minus t. So consider a $100 tax cut. This is going to decrease taxes by $100, which is going to increase disposable income by $100. But is that going to increase consumption by $100? As you can see in the equation, the MPC is there, and the MPC is less than 1. We're saying the MPC is 0.75, so an increase in disposable income of $100 is going to increase consumption spending by 0.75 times $100. So we're only actually going to see $75 of additional spending. Now, to be sure, that is going to multiply through in the same process, so we're going to get $75 of new spending times the multiplier of 4, which should increase output and income by $300. But again, we're closing a recessionary gap of $400, so that $100 tax cut was not sufficient to get the economy to full employment. Since the MPC tells us how much of the tax cut actually becomes spending, though, then the tax cut needs to be large enough so that multiplying it by the MPC produces $100. Algebraically, we can show this by saying that the MPC times the tax cut needs to equal the new spending we needed, in this case $100. If that's the case, then we can divide both sides of that equation by the MPC, giving us the tax cut we need should be equal to new spending needed, $100, divided by the MPC. For our numbers we're working with, that means we've got a $100 new spending need divided by a 0.75 MPC, which comes out to a tax cut of $133 and a third. That 133 and a third tax cut decreases taxes by 133 and a third. That's of course going to increase disposable income by 133 and a third, and then that's going to increase consumption by 133 and a third times the MPC 0.75. And it just so happens, not coincidentally, that 0.75 times 133 and a third is $100. So this way, with this 133 and a third tax cut, we're going to ultimately increase consumption spending by $100, which again will multiply through by 4, increasing total output and income ultimately by $400, and thus closing the recessionary gap. Now, recall that when the government spends more than it taxes, it's running a budget deficit, and for our purposes, we'll just ignore transfer payments here. When the government spends less than it taxes, it's running a surplus, and if government spending is equal to taxes, the budget is balanced. Now, if the budget was initially balanced in our example, then that $100 increase government spending would put the government into a deficit by $100. Likewise, the tax cut would put the government into deficits by $133 and a third dollars. So again, both of these are expansionary fiscal policy options, but because government spending has a direct impact on aggregate demand, less money is necessary, a smaller deficit is necessary from the government to close the recessionary gap as compared to a tax cut.